A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
I wonder how you might be thinking or even feeling about the potential for a lasting peace in the Middle East. Well, it's been a couple of weeks and the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas may be fragile, but it appears to be holding for now. The ceasefire is part of a 20-point peace plan led by US President Donald Trump, and it includes the mix of nations, including the likes of Egypt or Qatar or Turkey. But our special guest today says if Hamas remains true to its religious beliefs, it will not, and indeed could not, enter into a permanent peace with Israel. So what do you make of the fact that Hamas has not delivered the remaining bodies of hostages that died in their captivity? And what do you make of the political tensions and the fact that Hamas is still in control of most of Gaza? Well, our special guest through this coming hour, Dr. Mark Durie. He is founding director of the Institute for Spiritual Awareness and senior research fellow at Melbourne School of Theology. He is an expert, a Christian expert on Islam. And Mark Durie, always love our conversations. A special welcome back to 2020.
It's great to be with you again, Neil.
Hey, Mark, the ceasefire is largely holding for now. That's what the headlines are generally telling us. But is there any hope, do you think, for a lasting peace?
Yes, you can deal with short-term problems in a short-term way, but to have a long-term solution, you need a long-term way of solving it. The challenge is that Hamas is fundamentally a religious organization. It's a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Gazan branch, if you like. And a key part of the Muslim Brotherhood's platform or its ideology is to establish an Islamic state, a caliphate, in fact. It's a big ambition. It's not just about Israel. It's about the whole of the Middle East, in fact, potentially everywhere. But the Muslim Brotherhood took control in Egypt for a while, and that caused quite a lot of trauma. They eventually kicked out, but Hamas is really deeply committed to this idea of establishing an Islamic state, and there's no compromise really within that theological vision. Like or any alternative to that, like peaceful coexistence, is a contradiction of that goal. And in their constitution, they said very clearly that they don't accept a two-state solution, for example. So in longer term, I think Hamas will never accept an enduring peace.
You know, when we think of Hamas, the organisation, is it useful for us to be able to get a context? I mean, sometimes you've got Muslim Islam organisations that you might even characterise as being very secular, almost neutral and not really warmongers. You might have some who are moderates and you might have some who are extreme. Understanding the Hamas organisation here, is it useful to label them in any of those sorts of places on a spectrum? How do you see Hamas?
It's a bit of an external way of thinking about Islam, that there's moderate and extreme Islam. You could be better characterising it in terms of the theological agendas. Like Hamas is radical in the sense that it seeks to follow the fundamental teachings of Islam strictly, and it does see its vision as its mission as one involving violence and jihad. That is, it has a goal of a political outcome, and I think that's a really important distinction between different Islamic organizations. Like, does an organization intend or desire to seek political dominance, potentially through violence, or is it more concerned with helping people have a happy life and honour God and walk according to their faith, but without political aspirations? So Hamas is on the political side of the Islamic spectrum, and sometimes people call this Islamist to distinguish it from Islamic. That is the idea that their goal is to establish and impose an Islamic system. So that puts them in that place. Many Islamic organizations are not committed to an overtly political agenda like that.
Getting inside your head here, Mark, when you're watching the news and you're seeing the reporting, when you are aware of the religious depth of significance that is going on between the players in the Middle East, and you recognise that there are reporters who are reporting so often, sometimes according to the propaganda that they might be pushing, but sometimes with this sort of secular ideal that everybody thinks the same way as we do in the West. When you're looking at the headlines, do you look at the headlines because sometimes you're going to be interpreting those a little bit different because you seem to understand more deeply this Islamic mindset?
Yeah, so I mean, a secular view of the Israel-Palestine conflict is that you have two peoples who want to live in a land and they need to find some way of living together. And that obviously would involve some compromise, and each side needs to be willing to compromise in order to come to a deal. President Trump would be thinking about what's a deal in which each side can have an acceptable compromise and walk away with something. And the obvious outcome would be some kind of two-state solution. The problem is that it's not just a matter of two different groups trying to live together. It's that is certainly part of the equation, but there's also the reality of a theological agenda which says that it is completely unacceptable for Jews to have sovereignty in a land which has belonged to Islam, and there's a fundamental theological objection to the very existence of Israel. And that is also joined with a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes that are found in Islamic teaching. So those two elements together cause a kind of blockage on the Palestinian side to come to a compromise. And I think it is true to say that over the decades of the last 100 years or so, the Palestinians have repeatedly refused opportunities to have a two-state solution. So I think often in the West we think in very secular ways, and we underestimate the power of religion. We tend to regard religion as a sort of secondary effect, not really a fundamental driver of people's behaviour and activities. We look for other motives than religion. But I think in this case, in the case of Hamas, this is a religiously motivated organisation that has a religious agenda which ultimately allows no compromise. This particular stream or way of thinking about Islam does allow temporary compromise, or like a truce for a period of time, if it's in the interests of Hamas, but it will not be a permanent one. They might give the impression they're open to an enduring ceasefire, but I don't think that's truthful. They won't be speaking the truth if they do that.
Hey, come back to Donald Trump in the mix here for a few moments, because in the understanding, I guess, of listeners, they'll know that there was Donald Trump and assembling something like 20 nations or however many were around the table to come up with the peace deal. But Hamas was not around the table, neither was Israel around the table. So when we think of Trump, the deal maker, and then a declaration that the war is over, as you say, a short-term effect here, and there's pressure that's been applied, but the way that either Hamas or Israel, because they weren't around the table, they weren't signing off on documents, are they, do you think, feeling as though they are a part of this whole peace deal, or they've got a really good excuse not to be?
Well, I think Israel definitely wanted to find a deal where they could get the hostages back. This has been a huge issue inside Israel, causing a lot of division and conflict in the country. So Israel was highly motivated to find some way of getting the hostages back at a great cost. They've had to release a great many people, many of which they would not want to release. So that's the outcome for them, and a de-escalation of the conflict is also in Israel's interest. It doesn't want a perpetual war. It doesn't want to wipe Gaza off the map. It doesn't want to do a genocide of Palestinians either. It wants to live in peace. And it's also, what's been interesting is that this ceasefire has been in some sense in Hamas's interest. And that's a question of why were they willing to give back the hostages after being so unwilling to do that for a long time, and what what has changed there that's caused them to do that? And I think that's where Trump has actually come in. So the Hamas, the greatest threat to Hamas in the end is not actually the Israeli Defense Force, it's Gazans, because Gazans are increasingly angry and frustrated with Hamas. They are increasingly blaming Hamas for all the sufferings of the people of Gaza, and with good reason as well. I mean, the Hamas never built bomb shelters for the civilians of Gaza. It built tunnels to fight and wage a war. So I think they were coming under a lot of pressure, and we see that they've taken advantage of the ceasefire to kill off as many of their opponents as they could, and all these terrible videos showing them doing that. So that's one issue. They were at threat internally. And I think what's also happened is that some of their key sponsors and allies, like Turkey and Qatar, have come under pressure from America. America has a huge military base in Qatar, and it in a way protects Qatar, although Qatar has been funding and supporting Hamas, and it's a Muslim Brotherhood state, really. But America does have some leverage there, and I'm sure it has put pressure on some Middle Eastern countries. And then Trump's clever in the sense that quite a number of Middle Eastern countries, the last thing they want is for Hamas to succeed. They don't want the Muslim Brotherhood to be successful because it's a threat to them. And we saw that when the Muslim Brotherhood took over Egypt, and the other Islamic states were really upset about that. So I think that coalition of Middle Eastern countries was put together in an effective way, and it's caused this outcome that the hostages are returned and there's some kind of framework. But I'm sure that Hamas knew that it couldn't return all the hostages when it promised to do so. It was easy to promise, but they knew they couldn't. And I think that's probably because they don't even know where all the hostages are, where all the bodies are. So, but they took advantage of that opportunity to give them a chance to wipe out some of the opposition that was threatening them within Gaza, and that's been their win in this ceasefire.
Join the conversation. Text 0447 488 316 with a question or comment for today's guest.
In fact, I've got a text here to go with before we take any calls, Mark. Kim from WA says, just a question, do you really think that God is supporting what Israel is doing? This is not godly. Do you think God is really happy what Israel is doing? And a lot of the bodies that have not been handed back is maybe because they are buried under buildings that Israel have bombed. It's terrible that what Hamas did, but what Israel is doing has gone too far. There's an interesting one for your response. What stands out for you in Kim's text?
I think it's deeply distressing that apparently tens of thousands of Gazans have been killed in the conflict. It's really wrong. It's interesting that Kim particularly blames Israel for that and not Hamas, because the reality is that Hamas spent millions of dollars building a fighting apparatus under Gaza for this very situation. And they brought it on themselves and their people without any compassion for them. So, where you assign blame is interesting, and I think both sides have obviously been involved in the battle. The other thing is I'd ask Kim is, how far is not too far? Like, how much should Israel go to war against Hamas? Should they just wait until Hamas does the same thing all over again? Where do they stop? And I think Israel's made a decision that they want to eradicate Hamas. How do they do that? I mean, that's a question for anyone who takes a view like Kim has expressed. Like, what is reasonable in warfare if you've got an enemy that has structured its war in such a way that civilians are affected so profoundly? So, I mean, I think it's terrible tragedy what's for the Palestinians and the Gazans. Their sufferings are enormous, and you can only feel compassion for them. But realistically, what is the military strategy that Israel should be followed? I don't believe Israel is wanting, unlimited casualties. It's not going there to kill people. It's going there to try and destroy Hamas, and maybe to kill Hamas, but not the rest of the community. But and I think that if you say Israel should stop, you have to have an explanation for how they can win their war or deal with this threat. Because if you don't have that explanation, then you have no solution.
Okay, Kim, thank you so much for that text. And yes, appropriating blame to Hamas is a balance to this thought that it's all Israel's fault. Is God really pleased? There's a certain sense too, and just reflecting back to earlier conversations about this sort of thing, and Hamas in their underground tunnel system, provoking the war, then being under attack. I remember, Mark Durie, and just to come back to you on this, the question being asked, why is Hamas not allowing the Palestinian people above ground into the tunnel system to seek shelter when the provoked attack has brought those missiles in? There's a certain sense in which we might draw a conclusion here that Hamas doesn't care about the Palestinian people above ground. Any thoughts around that from you?
Yeah, I think it wanted its people to be killed, and they would speak about this in terms of the sacrifice that has to be made. We have to make a sacrifice in order to win the jihad. But yeah, they knew they were inviting aerial attacks, bombing. They knew that that's the way it would work, and they did absolutely nothing to build any safety or security for their people. There's no bomb shelters. What kind of government goes to war with an overwhelmingly more powerful state, with a much larger army, and makes no provision for the safety and care of their own people, and has no regard for them either, and then declares immediately after the October 7th attack that they would do this 1,000 times over if they could? What sort of government does that? And how would you neutralise that power? What means would you use? What would you recommend Israel do in order to deal with that threat? That is really the key question that needs to be considered by those who are upset with Israel. I think it is a tragedy, absolute tragedy for Gaza, what's happened. But to imply that it's all one side's fault is, I think, deeply mistaken.
You could be a part of our conversation today on 1-800-316-316. You can send us a text. Your own thoughts. Yes, it doesn't even have to agree with what we're talking about here today, but 0447 488 316. Let's take a call. Bridget is in Western Australia. Hey, Bridget, welcome along.
Hi, how are you?
Very good. What are your thoughts as you're listening in today?
Yeah, well, I just had a question for Mark to see what his thoughts were. It's kind of similar a little bit to what I guess the text from Kim from WA was saying. I've noticed as a local Christian that there's a bit of an uprising in some of the churches, that some Christians have become very pro-Palestinian, and I'm just not sure whether if they just don't understand the evil behind what Hamas actually is, extreme version of Islam. And there's actually, I've just myself noticed, what traditionally has been a pro-Israeli support from the churches. There's actually like this uprising in local churches of people who are now against Israel. And I think there's a bit of it feeding in from this understanding about, the banking system and how a lot of, Zionist Jews are sort of running, involved in the American system and those kind of things. So there's a lot of themes obviously going on, and there's no clear answer. But what does Mark think? He sort of, it was good what he said, but for me as a Christian, it's quite concerning that some Christians are being led astray and are pro-Palestinian, and maybe the rallies and everything have got a little bit to do with that. But what are your thoughts, Mark?
Mark, your thoughts for Bridget?
Well, there's definitely an influence of, you might say, traditional anti-Semitism that's coming into this, like talking about the Jews as this immensely powerful financial force in the world. This is classic hateful anti-Semitism, and it's really, really a sign that this is not just a rational response to the war. I think people are genuinely appalled at the number of Palestinian casualties that have been reported by Hamas, and they have trouble understanding why Israel would be fighting the war in the way they have. So I think Hamas has sort of won that propaganda war. You've also got the influence of anti-Semitic perspectives, both from kind of Western anti-Semitism, post-Christian anti-Semitism, and also Islamic anti-Semitism that are being injected into the local protest movements. And there's become a kind of demonization of the Jewish state that's been associated with that. And people want a simple answer. This is a very complex situation, and they want to kind of say, who are the bad people, who are the good people? And it's not as simple as that. And it's actually very, very difficult. Yeah, and How would you respond if you had an enemy that had killed thousands of your people and has sworn to repeat it 1,000 times? What level of response would be needed? I think one mistake people make is they think of Israel's interventions in Gaza or invasion of Gaza as retribution, as punishment. It's not punishment. The purpose is not to kind of tit for tat make Gaza suffer equivalently to how Israel suffered. The purpose is to eradicate Hamas, so that these sorts of attacks won't happen again in future. And it's against that goal that the military campaign needs to be waged. I don't want to in any way diminish the sufferings of the Gardens at all, but when you go to war with a powerful state and you hide yourself under hospitals and under mosques and in places where civilians need to be safe, and you do that deliberately in order to maximize your own casualties, really, then you bear some significant responsibility for what happens.
Bridget, anything further to add?
No, not really. That's pretty good. Yeah, you've covered, like you say, I think the main thing is it's not a straightforward situation like a lot of people would like. It's complex and there's a lot feeding into it, but I just would encourage Christians to, I guess, get educated a little bit on what's behind it, because it is quite concerning that we've got so many Christians now pro-Palestinian not understanding the situation.
Hey, Mark, just a few texts coming through. Sue says, "Hi, Neil, a question for Mark. How can the total destruction of Palestinians' homes and infrastructure be justified as a measure to eradicate Hamas? Thanks and blessings from Sue." How do we reflect on that sort of infrastructure loss? Thoughts from you?
I think the purpose of Israel's bombing campaign is not to destroy homes, it's to eradicate Hamas. And it's extremely dangerous and difficult to fight in urban environments where the enemy has tunnels and is prepared for it for a long time. It's very, very difficult. And it's not a battle you really want to be fighting. So, Israel is using its air force, it's using its bombs and so on, and it is very destructive. But it's not. What Israel is trying to avoid is to have October 7th happen again and again and again. That's what they're trying to stop. It's not. It's a very important long-term objective, which is to stop these sorts of attacks. And there have been rockets, thousands of rockets coming in against Israel from Gaza, from Hamas, for many, many years. They want to stop this, and that is why they're fighting and the way they are. The other thing I'd say is that in every war in which there is urban warfare against an entrenched enemy, there are casualties, and there will be civilian casualties too as well. And it's tragic that happens, but this is not a unique conflict in this respect. It's typical, actually.
Okay, another text. Pete in WA says, "As humans, we are to be very careful in how we deal with the land that God the Father has given to Israel. When he promised Abraham and made a covenant, this is God's allocated land that no one should be meddling with without seeing his will. Thank you." Any thoughts here for Pete?
Well, there's a deep question for Christians is, what is the theological significance of Israel? Is it the restoration to the land that God promised to them, the state of Israel? Many Christians believe that, and they see this as a fulfillment of prophecy, and that's one reason why many Christians support Israel. Another view is that this is not a fulfillment of promise. My view on this is quite complicated. I think aspects of the return of Israel seem to me to be miraculous and show the hand of God, but I'm not saying that I think every action or policy or deed of the Israeli government is righteous and good. Israel is not actually a religious state as such. It's a secular state which privileges one religion. I don't see it as a fulfillment of all the messianic promises of the Bible. But yeah, I think many Christians would see the existence of Israel as a sign of the hand of God at work, and that creates a lot of difficulties when you're looking at what's happening in Gaza and where the Palestinians should be placed in relation to that.
Okay, another text. Anthony in Melbourne says, and this goes a little bit along these lines of how we as Christian believers respond in our perhaps taking sides or not. Anthony says, Israel is the apple of God's eye. So interesting to contrast that, and thank you very much for that text, Anthony. Israel, the apple of God's eye. And the thought, as you mentioned a little earlier in our conversation, Mark, in Islam, when they have gained ground, they can't give that up easily. So you've got these two thoughts, Israel and the promised land, the covenant that God made with Abraham, and you've got the religious difference that comes with Islam of not being able to give up the land that they have gained. Anyway, thoughts here on the apple of God's eye, the people of Israel?
Well, I think there is evidence that God favours the Jews in history, and look at the number of Nobel Prize winners and the amazing achievements of the state of Israel. But that doesn't mean that we should hold Israel to a different standard that we hold other governments to, and we should, look to assess what the nation does and not give it a free pass just because we think that God may have blessed or been caring for them. So I think that's important. But I mean, this question also bears on the issue of the religious roots of the conflict, that there is this teaching in Islam that once land has been conquered and occupied by Islam, it forever belongs to Muslims. And it's the real objection to Israel is the idea that a Jewish majority could be running in charge of a state in the middle of what's considered to be Islamic territory. This is Hamas's objection, and the only way it can be resolved is through the destruction of Israel and also most of its inhabitants. So that is a fundamental driver of the conflict, whichever way you look at it. Even if you think of Israel as just a secular state without any religious significance, the Islamic side of the conflict remains the same, which is that it's completely unacceptable that Jews should have their own state in land which has been conquered by Islam. Okay. This is not a reciprocal vision; it's a one-sided vision. 1-800-316-316. You can join in our talkback conversation. Send us a text on 0447 488 316. Let's take another call. Lisa is Northern Beaches in New South Wales. Hey, Lisa, welcome along.
Hi there, everybody. Good to be here.
Lisa, what are your thoughts as you're listening in?
Oh, look, my thoughts are always with what's happening with the protests in Australia. I think it's been horrific since what's happened in Israel, on the 7th of October, and my heart has been very heavy since then. But my heart has been heavier still seeing the involvement of Australians with the protests that have been happening all around the country, and the hatred that has been happening between people that would normally have been able to sit down and have a cup of tea or whatever to socialise. And I'm just wondering if I could just ask what the response is to what do we do now with the protests? I know that the chants will probably continue from the river to the sea, which, by the way, I understand comes from the book of Deuteronomy, originally about Israel. And so, in a sense, they're actually declaring the word of God. But it's the hatred, I suppose, and the concern about immigration and what do we do, when we have refugees, perhaps from, places and ideologies that we're concerned about. As a Christian, that's the most difficult thing, I suppose, that I have to tackle. And that is that, we know that God loves all people and has died for everybody and has sacrificed himself for all sins to be forgiven. But when it comes to these ideologies, how do we actually grapple with Australia and people coming from other countries, including from what's happened in Gaza now? How do we respond?
Lisa, wonderful and insightful, and I can tell you think very deeply about these things. Mark, thoughts for Lisa?
This is a deep question for many Western nations, and we have developed a policy on immigration which is based on the assumption that all cultures are basically good And the more diverse they are, the better. There's kind of strength in diversity of cultures. Diversity is our strength. And we've also at the same time believed that religion's basically largely irrelevant, and where it does play a role, it's as part of culture. It's kind of quaint and interesting, but it's not really important. These beliefs have provided a kind of ideology of immigration, which I think is failing, because when people come in from other cultures, they bring their own religions with them, their own ideological stances on religious and spiritual issues, and they're not necessarily compatible, and they can be incompatible. For example, I believe it is the case that Islamic teaching has an anti-Semitic stream to it. There's a lot of anti-Jewish statements in the Quran, in the life of Muhammad, and these influence Muslims around the world in different ways. And it's, I want to acknowledge that there's a Christian anti-Semitism as well. I'm not saying that Islam's the only source of anti-Semitism, but it is a major source, and it's significant around the world today. And it's played a major role in these protests too. And it is partly driving the conflict for various reasons. So we have absorbed, we have embraced as it were, to our heart, religious traditions and views of the world that are not all compatible, and that need some sort of resolution. And the problem is we don't have a solution to this. We can't undo the policies of multiculturalism and their effects on us. And in fact, it's a very painful and difficult topic for us to even begin to talk about today.
Lisa, anything further to add?
I think that was a great answer. And obviously, immigration marches are happening around the country, as well as what's happening, I believe, this weekend with the Christians Against Anti-Semitism, which I'll be supporting. But I just would like to reiterate the fact that, we really need to get the message out there with regards to the gospel, and we as Christians need to spread that message of love, that Christ has died for all, and that I believe that he will give us wisdom in relation to immigration and the problem that is arising in our own country of Australia. But that we do need to do that with compassion and care for every individual. And, the concern is obviously that Sharia law may come into this country. Obviously, that's something that people are not bold enough to say is a concern. But I've been speaking to a lot of people in the community, and they will quietly say that they're concerned about Sharia law being inconsistent with the Australian law, and that it's already sort of entered the UK. And I suppose I would love to see more of a conversation about that as well.
Wonderful insight, a good contribution, Lisa. Really appreciate you calling in, and I'll get a thought or two from Mark on this. And I wonder if when we talk about, fears that we might have of Sharia law being introduced in Australia, even parallel that people might like to talk about, I wonder whether there might be some comment from you around the thought, Mark, that there might be a weakness in a democracy that is detached from its foundations of morality, that might come back to those biblical foundations on which our colony was birthed in and has grown into, that have given to us so many of these blessings and freedoms that we have. But if you're detached from that biblical view, there's the potential for bowing to all sorts of ideologies, and once the lid is out and the genie's out of the bottle is another sort of analogy there. But what are your thoughts here? I mean, based on what Lisa's sharing and this idea of, our secularised democracy. Thoughts, Mark?
I'm mindful of two contributions that Ayaan Hirsi Ali made. She's a former Somali radical Muslim who became an atheist and then more recently a Christian. And some years ago, she was saying we need to have a conversation about Sharia, and it's necessary, and what it involves, and what are the implications. Sharia is basically the Islamic way of life, and but it has a political and social dimension to it. But how do we talk about it? Because once you say anything critical, you are likely to be accused of being racist or Islamophobic, And there are indeed quite aggressive agendas to stop that conversation from happening. So that's one thought. We do need to have a conversation about Islamic law and about religion in general and its contribution to social well-being. The second thing is that earlier this year at the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship Conference in London, Ayaan Hirsi Ali gave a really important talk about what makes democracy stable and effective. And she points out that there's really fundamental principles that underpin the tradition, the European tradition of democracy, which are dependent on Christian values. The idea that people are made in the image of God, the idea of love for those that are vulnerable, and a number of other ideas that she laid out. Now, this is really difficult for us because we've walked away from these foundations. And if over time the effect of that is a gradual breaking down and disintegration of the elements that have made our society peaceful and a good place to live, a place where many immigrants want to come to, then that could be a tragedy. But the problem is we're sort of sleepwalking into that outcome because we don't also have a space to really talk about the Christian heritage in our nation as well. That's also a taboo topic in a way. It's not acknowledged. So, yeah, I think Western societies are indeed at risk of losing their stability because of the watering down of these fundamentally spiritual religious principles.
Okay, churches need to get stronger and believers need to be open and able to argue the good things about our Christian faith. Hey, thanks so much to Lisa, who really sparked that conversation. A text from Glenn in Victoria. Glenn says, "Hi Neil and Mark, how can we trust Hamas figures on Gazan deaths? Can't we get figures from an honest body?" Quick response from you on that one, Mark.
Well, I think you can't trust Hamas figures. They're devoted to the principle of which Muhammad said that war is deceit, and they have a long track record of not speaking the truth. So, but to jump from that, from saying, look, we can't trust Hamas's figures, to say that there are no casualties or that it's completely overblown, that's not an obvious conclusion either. Obviously, a lot of people have been killed. And it's deeply distressing that there have been a lot of casualties, which there have been, and many people are rendered homeless too. So, I mean, one of the challenges in this conflict is that a Christian should have compassion for all people who suffer, not just those of one side or another. Even if you feel that people are complicit and somehow responsible in bringing the war down on their heads, doesn't mean that you should lose the capacity for compassion for them. Jesus said even love your enemies, and I think that means loving other people's enemies as well, So the challenge is to maintain compassion for all sides, but there are some things we can't know answers to, and we cannot get an accurate figure of Gazan casualties apart from all we have is Hamas's figures, and as we know, Hamas has an incredible track record of not speaking the truth, so we just have to live with that and acknowledge that and not just take what they say as gospel truth.
Let's squeeze in one more call. Sue is in Kingston in Tasmania. Hey, Sue, need to be quick. What are your thoughts?
Hello, Neil and Mark. Yes, I've got a query because Mark would no doubt be aware of Surah 8, verse 61, that says, "But if they incline to peace, you also incline to it." And Surah 28, verse 49, saying, "Then bring a book from Allah, which is a better guide than the Torah and the Quran." So going on what Lisa raised in her conversation in terms of Sharia law and Islam coming to Australia, to our secular country, surely these are questions that need to be explored and these verses run with, because there's a solution, and it's the New Testament, it's the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Well, Sue, significant things. I'm sure there's a long conversation about that, but the aspiration of Islam and Sharia law around the world, there have been big inroads into that, and doesn't make it any easier when Christians can't see through some of those challenges. Very quick response from you on that, Mark?
I think Sue's right. We do need to understand the Quran, and there are positive and negative verses in the Quran about non-believers. For example, Surah 8:56 says that the infidels will break their covenant every time, and you can't trust them. So it's, you have to take the whole of the book and look at it in context. And I agree with you. There is a way, which is to find peace, which is to follow Jesus Christ. He's the Prince of Peace. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much to Sue in Tasmania. Hey, just to wrap things together here, Mark, and earlier on I said, you could be a pessimist, you could be an optimist, you can be a realist. I painted you into the realist picture, and I think as listeners have heard you share some things there. As we're talking about the future, what is ahead? These days that are dark days are not over yet. There's the difference between a truce and peace. I wonder if you've got any thoughts here, wrapping some things together around what we might understand about what might be ahead by way of the peace process, leading to maybe something that might be more lasting.
Well, Hamas's radical ideology allows for the possibility of a truce if it's in the interests of it's in their own interests. For example, they're too weak to fight. But it doesn't allow for permanent peace. It doesn't allow for coexistence, and that needs to be acknowledged. So the best way forward really is for them to be sidelined, and the most likely approach is to somehow discredit the theological agenda they present, that is that jihad is the only way to victory and the only way to peace. So that needs to be discredited. And, I think many Islamic nations are threatened by Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and they'd like to see a different way forward. So that's, I think, Israel and the Palestinians' best hope is that this agenda of constant jihad and, unending warfare until at last the war is against Israel is won and it's destroyed. This agenda needs to be thoroughly discredited, and whether that will happen, I think there's certainly Muslim states who would like to see that discredited because it threatens them as well. But it's a very long-term issue. It's not going to go away just overnight.
And interesting, isn't it? The way the propaganda war is continuing, and there'll be more of that to come. Here we are as Christian believers, the other side of the world, standing in the balance, and a lot of Christians drawn one way or the other, depending on what media sources they are listening to. To read a little more deeply, let me encourage listeners, this is one of those websites you might want to visit and check out the resources that there is at markdurie.com. D-U-R-I-E, markdurie.com. Mark has written a whole lot of books as well, and some of those award-winning books. Let me just list a few of them. The Third Choice, Islam, Dimitude and Freedom. You might be wondering what dimitude is. You'll have to do a little bit more research on that. Liberty to the Captives, Freedom from Islam and Dimitude Through the Cross. There's another one called Revelation, Do We Worship the Same God? And Double-Minded, How Sex is Dividing the Australian Church. He's a authority on a whole lot of different dimensions. We could have been having a conversation today about the worldwide split in the Anglican movement, and Mark would be an expert in that area as well. Sex dividing the Australian Church. He's monitoring the way our culture is changing, and you might want to get a hold of some of his books for a deeper conversation about these big issues that we as Christian believers need to have our hearts and our heads around. Dr. Mark Durie is the founding director of the Institute for Spiritual Awareness. I mentioned he's Senior Research Fellow at the Melbourne School of Theology, a Christian expert on Islam. That website is markdurie.com. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your heart with us today on 2020.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.